He didn't speak. He just watched the young recruits train, barely noticed by anyone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground as dozens of fresh-faced soldiers stumbled through their drills, sweat already beading on their foreheads despite the early hour. In the corner, sitting on a weathered wooden bench that had seen countless seasons, was an old man in civilian clothes. Plain khaki pants, a faded blue shirt, and worn leather boots that had walked more miles than most people could imagine. Nobody paid him any attention. Not the drill sergeants barking orders. Not the recruits gasping for breath during their morning PT. Not even the base commander who had walked past him twice without a second glance. He was just another visitor, maybe someone's grandfather watching training, maybe a contractor waiting for a meeting. Just another face in the background of military life. But when one soldier froze mid-push-up, looked up, and saw something that made his blood run cold, when that same soldier slowly rose to his feet and whispered a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in years, the entire camp went silent. Because the quiet old man sitting on that bench wasn't just anyone. He wasn't someone's grandfather. He wasn't a contractor. He was a ghost from the history books, a legend that every soldier learns about but never expects to meet. The training stopped. The shouting died. And for the first time that morning, every head turned toward the old man. Because he wasn't a visitor. He wasn't a ghost. He was living history. And today, he had quietly returned to the battlefield where warriors are forged. Welcome to the Silent Salute. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. Your support means everything to us, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button. We're growing every day, and every single one of you makes that possible. Thank you for being part of our community. The Fort Benning training facility stretched across hundreds of acres of Georgia countryside, a place where boys become soldiers and soldiers become warriors. It was 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning in late September, and the air still carried the coolness of night mixed with the promise of another scorching day. The 3rd Battalion was midway through their basic training cycle, that grueling 16-week transformation that would either break them or forge them into United States Army infantry. Staff Sergeant Martinez had been running drills since before dawn, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Push-ups, sit-ups, mountain climbers, bear crawls, the endless cycle of physical conditioning that would prepare these young men and women for whatever hell awaited them downrange. Some were keeping up. Others were struggling. A few looked like they might not make it through the week. Private First Class Johnson was among the strugglers. At 19, he was tall and lean but lacked the mental toughness that separated survivors from casualties. His form was sloppy, his breathing labored, and his eyes held that distant look of someone already considering quitting. Martinez had seen it 1,000 times before, the exact moment when a recruit's will began to crumble. "Johnson, what did I tell you about keeping your back straight?" Martinez's voice cracked like a whip. "You think the enemy's gonna wait for you to figure out how to do a proper push-up?" Johnson's arms trembled as he tried to correct his form, but his strength was already gone. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, defeated. Around him, other recruits continued their exercises, but their eyes flickered toward him with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the ones being singled out. That's when Johnson's gaze wandered to the bench. The old man had been sitting there for maybe 20 minutes, arriving shortly after the morning formation. He hadn't asked permission to observe, hadn't checked in with anyone, hadn't even acknowledged the drill sergeants when they'd noticed him. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap, watching the training with the kind of attention that suggested he understood exactly what he was seeing. His face was weathered, lined with the deep creases that come from decades of squinting into sun and wind. His hair was silver white and cut short, not quite military regulation, but close enough to suggest old habits die hard. There was something in his posture, even sitting down, that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, and though he appeared relaxed, there was a coiled readiness about him that suggested he could move quickly if necessary. But it was his eyes that caught Johnson's attention. They were pale blue, almost gray, and they held something that the young recruit couldn't quite identify. Not judgment, not criticism, but something deeper. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. As if he'd seen this exact scenario play out countless times before. Johnson found himself staring, even as Martinez continued to berate him. There was something familiar about the man, something that nagged at the edges of his memory like a half-remembered dream. He'd seen that face before, but where? Johnson, eyes front. Martinez's voice snapped him back to reality. You got time to be sightseeing. You got time to give me 20 more push-ups. But as Johnson dropped back into position, his mind was racing. The old man's face, those eyes, something about the way he carried himself. And then it hit him. Not all at once, but in pieces, like a puzzle slowly coming together. The angle of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the way he held his head when he was thinking. Johnson had seen photographs. Black and white images in textbooks, grainy footage in documentaries, portraits hanging in the halls of military academies. But those had been of a young man, a soldier in his prime, not this elderly civilian watching training from a bench. His hands began to shake, and it wasn't from the exercise. The name formed in his mind before he could stop it, impossible and yet undeniable. He tried to push it away, told himself he was being ridiculous, that his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the more he looked, the more certain he became. The bone structure was the same. The way the man's eyes narrowed slightly when he concentrated, the small scar above his left eyebrow that was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Johnson's arms gave out completely. He collapsed to the ground, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion. His entire body had gone numb as the reality of what he was seeing crashed over him like a wave. Around him, the other recruits continued their exercises, oblivious to the living legend sitting just 30 feet away. Jesus Christ. Johnson, what is wrong with you? Martinez stormed over, his face red with frustration. You having some kind of breakdown? You need medical attention? But Johnson couldn't answer. He was staring at the bench, at the man who had turned slightly to watch the commotion. And in that moment, with the light hitting his face just right, there was no doubt left. Slowly, trembling, Johnson pushed himself to his feet. The other recruits had stopped their exercises now, sensing that something was happening, something different from the usual breakdown of a struggling soldier. Martinez was still talking, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. Johnson took a step toward the bench, then another. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, like he was walking through a dream. The old man watched him approach with mild curiosity, his expression unchanged, giving no sign that he recognized the recognition in Johnson's eyes. Son, what are you doing? Martinez's voice had changed, losing its harsh edge and taking on a note of concern. Get back in formation. But Johnson couldn't stop. He was 5 feet away now, then 3, then standing directly in front of the bench. The old man looked up at him with those pale blue eyes, and Johnson saw something flicker there. Not surprise, exactly, but acknowledgement. As if he'd been expecting this moment. The training ground had gone quiet. 50 recruits stood frozen in various states of exercise, their attention focused on the strange tableau playing out before them. Martinez had stopped shouting. Even the other drill sergeants had noticed the sudden silence and were moving closer to see what was happening. Johnson's mouth was dry as sand. He tried to speak, but no words came. How do you address a living legend? How do you speak to someone whose story you've heard 100 times, whose actions you've studied in military history classes, whose name is synonymous with courage and sacrifice? The old man waited patiently, as if he understood the turmoil in the young soldier's mind. Finally, Johnson found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Sergeant Major William Iron Mike Patterson? The question hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, nobody moved. The old man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of the past, maybe, or the weight of a name he hadn't heard spoken in a long time. And then, slowly, he nodded. The effect was immediate and electric. Johnson's knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground, not in collapse, but in reverence. His right hand snapped to his forehead in the sharpest salute he'd ever given, his whole body trembling with the magnitude of what he was doing. Sergeant Major, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. It's an honor, sir. An honor. The silence that followed was deafening. Martinez stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, trying to process what he'd just heard. The other recruits looked confused, the name meaning nothing to them yet, but they could feel the shift in the air, the sudden weight of something momentous. And then Martinez's face went white. He knew the name. Every career soldier knew the name. Every drill sergeant had heard the stories, had used them to motivate recruits, had invoked the legend of Iron Mike Patterson in 1,000 different training scenarios. But the man was supposed to be dead, killed in action in Vietnam 50 years ago. That's what the official records said. That's what the history books taught. But Martinez was looking at him now, seeing the face that matched the photographs, recognizing the bearing that could only belong to one man. The Medal of Honor recipient who had single-handedly held off an entire North Vietnamese regiment. The soldier who had saved 47 American lives in a single day of fighting. The man who had supposedly died in that jungle, whose body had never been recovered, whose sacrifice had become the stuff of military legend. Except he wasn't dead. He was sitting on a bench at Fort Benning, watching recruits train, very much alive and very much present. Martinez's training kicked in before his mind could fully process what was happening. His body snapped to attention, his hand rising in a salute that was both automatic and reverent. Around him, the other drill sergeants were beginning to understand, their faces showing the same mixture of disbelief and awe that Johnson had felt moments before. "Sergeant Major," Martinez said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. We didn't know you were here, sir." Patterson looked up at the young staff sergeant, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. It was a small smile, tired but genuine, the expression of a man who had carried a heavy burden for a very long time. "I'm not here officially," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command despite its quiet tone. "I was just visiting, watching the next generation train." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of history. This was the man who had fought in the bloodiest battles of Vietnam, who had earned his Medal of Honor in a firefight that lasted 18 hours, who had been presumed dead for half a century. And he was here, now, watching their training with the same careful attention he had once given to enemy movements in the jungle. Martinez struggled to find words. Protocol demanded certain responses, but there was no protocol for this situation. How do you address a ghost? How do you speak to a legend who had supposedly died before you were born? "Sir," Martinez finally managed. Would you like to address the troops? They should know who you are, sir. They should hear your story." Patterson considered this for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the assembled recruits. Most of them were still confused, still trying to understand why their drill sergeant was saluting an old man in civilian clothes. But Johnson remained at attention, his salute unwavering, and gradually other soldiers were beginning to follow suit as the names spread through the ranks in whispered conversations. "I don't know about that," Patterson said finally. "I'm not really one for speeches." But Martinez wasn't ready to let this moment pass. "Sir, with respect, these soldiers need to see this. They need to know that the stories they've heard, the legends they've learned about, they're real. You're real." Patterson's smile widened slightly, and he slowly pushed himself to his feet. Even at his advanced age, he moved with the fluid grace of a lifelong soldier, his posture straightening into a bearing that commanded instant respect. Standing, he was taller than he had appeared sitting down, and there was something in his presence that seemed to fill the space around him. "All right," he said, his voice carrying easily across the training ground. "But I'm not giving a speech. I'm just going to tell you something that might help you understand what you're here for." The recruits had formed an impromptu formation, their bodies automatically assuming the position of attention even though no order had been given. They sensed, even without fully understanding, that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. Patterson walked to the center of the formation, his steps measured and deliberate. When he reached the middle, he stopped and looked around at the faces surrounding him. Young faces, most of them, filled with a mixture of curiosity and growing awareness. These were the soldiers who would carry on the tradition he had helped to forge, who would face their own trials and make their own sacrifices. "My name is William Patterson," he began, his voice calm and steady. 53 years ago, I was a young sergeant in the 173rd Airborne Brigade, serving in the Republic of Vietnam. On November 18, 1970, my unit was overrun by elements of the North Vietnamese Army near the town of Dak Tu. The silence was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the very air was holding its breath. "We were outnumbered 15-1, Patterson continued. "My commanding officer was killed in the first minutes of the attack. Most of my squad was wounded or pinned down. We had no air support, no artillery, no reinforcements coming. We had two choices, surrender or fight. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Several of the recruits were wide-eyed, hanging on every word. Others looked skeptical, as if they couldn't quite believe they were hearing this story from the man who had lived it. I chose to fight, Patterson said simply. Not because I was brave, not because I was a hero, but because I had brothers depending on me. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Sometimes you don't need to be extraordinary. You just need to be there for the person next to you. Johnson felt tears streaming down his face, but he didn't move to wipe them away. He had read about this battle, had studied the tactical situation in military history classes. Operation Dak had been one of the bloodiest engagements of the Vietnam War, and the actions of Sergeant William Patterson had become legendary among military historians. But hearing it from the man himself, seeing the quiet dignity with which he spoke of events that had shaped military doctrine for generations, was overwhelming. I held that position for 18 hours, Patterson continued. I used every weapon I could find, every trick I'd learned, every ounce of strength I had. Not because I wanted to be a hero, but because 47 of my brothers were depending on me to get them home. And in the end, that's what happened. They went home. They lived. They had families, careers, lives that mattered. He looked around the formation again, his pale eyes meeting those of the recruits one by one. The medal they gave me, the recognition, the stories people tell, none of that was why I fought. I fought because it was my job. I fought because it was right. I fought because someone had to. Martinez found his voice. Sir, the records show. I mean, we were taught that you were killed in that action. How? Patterson's smile was sad now, tinged with a weariness that spoke of decades of carrying secrets. I was badly wounded. Critical condition. They evacuated me to Japan, then to Germany, then to Walter Reed. The doctors weren't sure I would make it. The Army, in their wisdom, decided it would be better if the world thought I had died a hero rather than lived as a broken man. The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. The recruits were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were hearing, the implications of a legend revealed to be not just alive, but standing among them. I spent 2 years in military hospitals, Patterson continued. When I was finally discharged, I was given a new identity, a pension, and a request to remain dead. The Army felt that my story was more powerful as a legend than as a reality. And for a long time, I agreed with them. He paused, looking down at his hands. I've spent the last 50 years living quietly, trying to be normal, trying to forget what I'd seen and done. I thought I was finished with the military, that my service was over. But lately, I've been thinking about those 47 men I saved, about the lives they lived because of that one day. And I realized that maybe my service wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. The emotional weight of his words was crushing. Several of the recruits were crying openly now, overwhelmed by the presence of a living legend and the story he was telling. Martinez felt his own eyes burning with tears he was trying to hold back. The point is, Patterson said, his voice growing stronger, you don't become a soldier because you want to be a hero. You become a soldier because you want to serve something bigger than yourself. You want to protect the people who can't protect themselves. You want to stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. He gestured toward the recruits around him. Each of you made a choice to be here. You chose to serve. You chose to sacrifice. You chose to put your lives on the line for people you'll never meet, for freedoms you'll never see fully appreciated. That choice makes you heroes, whether you ever fire a shot in anger or not. Johnson, still at attention, felt something shift inside him. The doubt that had been plaguing him since he'd arrived at basic training, the questions about whether he was strong enough, tough enough, good enough, they suddenly seemed less important. He was part of something greater, something that stretched back through decades of service and sacrifice. The training you're doing here, Patterson continued, it's not just about physical fitness or learning to follow orders. It's about building the character that will sustain you when everything else falls apart. It's about developing the bonds of brotherhood that will carry you through the darkest moments. It's about understanding that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. He turned toward Martinez. Staff Sergeant, these soldiers you're training, they're not just recruits. They're the next generation of guardians. They're the ones who will carry on the traditions we've built, who will face threats we can't imagine, who will make sacrifices we can't comprehend. Treat them with the respect they deserve. Martinez nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Around him, the other drill sergeants stood at attention, their usual harsh demeanor replaced by something approaching reverence. Patterson looked around the formation one final time. I didn't come here to give speeches or tell war stories. I came here because I wanted to see the future of our military. I wanted to meet the soldiers who will carry on when my generation is gone. And I have to tell you, I'm impressed. I'm proud. And I'm grateful. He stepped back, preparing to leave, but Johnson spoke up. Sir, wait. Please. The young soldier's voice was stronger now, filled with a confidence that hadn't been there an hour ago. Could you tell us about the medal? About what it means to you? Patterson stopped, considering the question. Slowly, he reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew something that made several of the recruits gasp audibly. It was a small, light blue ribbon attached to a bronze star, the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. I've carried this every day for 53 years, he said quietly. Not because I'm proud of what I did, but because it reminds me of what I'm responsible for. This medal doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the 47 men who lived because of one day of fighting. It belongs to their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. It belongs to every soldier who ever put their life on the line for something bigger than themselves. He held the medal up, letting the morning sun catch the bronze and make it gleam. This is what service looks like. Not the medal and ribbon, but the commitment it represents. The promise that no matter what happens, no matter how dark things get, there will always be people willing to stand up and fight for what's right. Patterson looked directly at Johnson. You asked me about the medal, son. But the real question is, what are you going to do with your life that's worthy of it? How are you going to serve? How are you going to make a difference? Johnson felt the weight of the question settle on his shoulders, but for the first time since he'd arrived at basic training, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a challenge, an opportunity, a chance to be part of something that mattered. I don't know yet, sir, he said honestly, but I'm going to find out. Patterson smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. That's all any of us can do, son. Find out. And when you do, when you figure out what you're fighting for, you'll be ready for whatever comes next. He turned to address the entire formation. The Army will teach you tactics, weapons, strategy. But they can't teach you courage. They can't teach you honor. They can't teach you love. And that's what this is really about. Love for your country, love for your fellow soldiers, love for the ideals we've sworn to defend. The old soldier began to walk toward the edge of the training ground, but he paused and looked back over his shoulder. One more thing, he said. The stories you'll hear about me, about what I did in Vietnam, they're true, but they're not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was scared every minute of those 18 hours. I was hurt. I was tired. I was ready to quit a dozen times. But I didn't quit because I couldn't bear the thought of letting my brothers down. He straightened his shoulders. That's the real lesson here. It's not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. It's about pushing through when everything in you wants to give up. It's about standing up when it would be easier to stay down. Patterson walked away then, his steps steady and sure. The recruits remained at attention until he disappeared from sight, their minds reeling from what they had just experienced. They had met a legend, heard his story, seen his humanity, and in doing so, they had glimpsed something of their own potential. Martinez slowly called the formation to attention, his voice hoarse with emotion. What you just witnessed, he said, is what we're training you to become. Not necessarily Medal of Honor recipients, but soldiers who understand the weight of service, who comprehend the significance of sacrifice, who recognize that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. He paused, looking around at the faces before him. That man lived through hell and came back to tell about it. He carried the weight of that experience for 50 years, and he did it with dignity, with honor, with grace. That's the standard we're trying to help you achieve. Johnson felt different as he fell back into formation. The doubt was still there, the uncertainty about his own capabilities, but it was overshadowed now by something stronger, a sense of purpose, an understanding of what he was training for, a recognition that he was part of something larger than himself. The training resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. The recruits pushed harder, ran faster, endured more. They had seen what dedication looked like, what service meant, what sacrifice could accomplish. They had met a man who had faced the ultimate test, and emerged not just victorious, but transformed. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature began to rise, Johnson found himself thinking about the medal Patterson had shown them. Not the physical object, but what it represented, the countless acts of courage, large and small, that had built the military tradition he was now part of. The chain of service that stretched back through generations of soldiers, each one adding their own link, their own story, their own sacrifice. He thought about the 47 men who had lived because of one sergeant's refusal to give up, about the families they had raised, the lives they had lived, the contributions they had made to the world. He thought about the ripple effects of that single day of fighting, how one act of courage had resonated through decades, touching lives that would never know the source of their good fortune. And he thought about his own place in that chain, his own opportunity to serve, to sacrifice, to make a difference in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The training continued, but Johnson was no longer the same soldier who had collapsed that morning. He had been touched by greatness, inspired by legend, transformed by the simple act of meeting a man who had chosen to do what was right when it would have been easier to give up. As the day wore on and the exercises continued, word of what had happened spread throughout the base. Officers came to observe, senior NCOs shared stories, and gradually the legend of Iron Mike Patterson began to live again, not as a ghost from the past, but as a living reminder of what service could accomplish. But Patterson himself was already gone, having slipped away as quietly as he had arrived. He had said what he came to say, done what he came to do, and now he was returning to the quiet life he had built for himself over the past 50 years. Yet his impact remained, carved into the hearts and minds of the young soldiers who had been privileged to meet him. They would carry his story forward, share his wisdom, and strive to live up to the example he had set. The legend would continue, not as a tale from the history books, but as a living inspiration for future generations of warriors. Sometimes a hero doesn't look like what we expect. Sometimes he's an old man in civilian clothes, sitting quietly on a bench, watching the next generation prepare for battles he hopes they'll never have to fight. Sometimes he's a ghost from the past who chooses to step back into the light, not for glory or recognition, but to remind us all of what service really means. William Iron Mike Patterson had spent 50 years in the shadows, carrying the weight of his experiences alone. But on that Tuesday morning at Fort Benning, he chose to share that weight, to pass on the lessons he had learned, to inspire a new generation of soldiers to carry on the traditions he had helped to build. The Medal of Honor around his neck was more than just a decoration. It was a symbol of the unbreakable bond between those who serve, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, and a testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when the need arises. As the recruits continued their training, they carried with them the knowledge that they had been touched by greatness, that they had met a man who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious not just in battle, but in character. They had seen what it meant to serve with honor, to sacrifice with dignity, and to carry the weight of responsibility with grace. The legend of Iron Mike Patterson would live on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of the soldiers he had inspired, the lives he had touched, and the example he had set. He had shown them that heroism isn't about being perfect, it's about being present, being willing, and being ready to do what's right when everything else falls apart. This story was brought to you by the Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who carried their burdens quietly, served with dignity, and inspired others through their example rather than their words? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how they changed your life. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, if you believe that the quiet heroes among us deserve to have their stories told, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue to share the stories of extraordinary people who remind us what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to stand up for what's right.